Leela Fairchild stood in front of the tall, gilded mirror inside the bridal suite, her reflection framed by a cascade of ivory silk. The gown's fitted bodice embraced her figure like a promise, the delicate lace sleeves catching the warm afternoon sunlight streaming through the wide windows. For months, she had imagined this momentous stillness before everything began. In just under 2 hours, she was supposed to walk down an aisle lined with white roses, the petals releasing their faint perfume into the air, and say yes to Adrian Crossman she had loved for 4 years. The man she had believed she would grow old beside. Her heart should have been drumming with joy, each beat a giddy reminder of the life she was about to start. But instead, there was a strange hollowness deep in her chest, as though some invisible hand had scooped out all the excitement she thought she'd feel and left only a quiet ache. She couldn't explain it. A buzz interrupted the fragile silence. Her phone lit up on the vanity table, the screen flashing with a message from her maid of honor, Maya Lynn. Leela, I need to talk to you. It's urgent. Meet me in the hotel lobby now. There was something in Maya's tone even through text that made Lila's stomach twist. She lifted the hem of her dress and began the careful descent toward the lobby, her heels clicking against the marble floors of the luxury hotel. The elegant surroundings blurred around her. She had eyes only for the figure waiting near the elevator. Maya stood stiff and pale, clutching her phone so tightly it looked like it might shatter. What's wrong? Leela asked, her voice already taut with dread. You look like you've seen a ghost. Maya's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. I'm so sorry, she said, her words trembling. I didn't know how to tell you this, but you need to see something before you walk down that aisle. Her fingers shook as she held out her phone. Leela took item in a single heartbeat, her world fractured into sharp, unrecognizable pieces. On the screen was Adrian, her Adrian, his mouth pressed hungrily to someone else's, his hands tangled in the familiar copper-red hair of her cousin, Clara Fairchild. The timestamp glared at her from the corner of the image. 30 minutes ago. There are more, Maya whispered, swiping through a series of photos. Clara's body pressed against Adrian's in the hotel's garden, his palm cupping her jaw with the intimacy of a man who wasn't in any rush to let go. The same cousin Leela had shared childhood summers with. The same cousin she'd trusted implicitly. The phone nearly slipped from Lila's numb fingers, but Meyer caught it before it hit the floor. I was on my way to help with your bouquet, Meyer said softly, and I saw them. I'm so sorry. The ivory gownance, the embodiment of her dream, suddenly felt like a prison cell stitched from silk. Lila's breath came in ragged bursts, her vision blurring. She didn't say another word. Gathering the skirt in her fists, she turned and fled back to the bridal suite. Her hands fumbled with the tiny buttons running down her back, the stubborn fabric refusing to release her. The dress that had taken 3 people to help her into now seemed to fight her every movement. At last, she managed to peel it off, the silk pooling at her feet like melted illusions. Jeans, an oversized sweater, flat shoes. She grabbed her purse and car keys, ignoring Maya's voice calling after her. Leela couldn't face Adrian's listener in front of the 150 guests who had gathered to witness what was supposed to be the happiest day of her life. The city blurred past the windshield as she drove, her tears smearing the carefully applied makeup that had taken hours to perfect. She had no destination, only the desperate need to keep moving until the air felt breathable again. Then, like an answer to a question she hadn't asked, she saw it. The Belvedere, an upscale bar tucked between glass-walled office towers, its elegant sign glowing like a secret invitation, a place where no one would know her name. Inside, the lighting was low and golden, the air carrying the faint scent of oak and polished brass. Heavy velvet curtains muffled the outside world. A slow, lazy jazz melody threaded through the background. She chose a secluded booth in the farthest corner, her back to the room. A moment later, a man in his mid-40s approached with a kind smile and a bartender's easy understanding. Rough day, he asked as he set her drink in front of her. You could say that, she replied hoarsely. I was supposed to get married today. Ethan Cole nodded, polishing a glass in his hand. Sometimes life has other plans. Not always the ones we expect, but sometimes They're the ones we need. Leela managed a faint smile before her gaze drifted toward the far end of the bar. That's when she saw him. Even in the dim light, the man exuded an undeniable magnetism. His dark hair was slightly tousled, his tailored jacket resting on the back of his chair. He sat alone, one hand coiled around a glass of top-shelf bourbon, his eyes fixed on the amber liquid as though it might whisper answers to questions no one else could hear. His name was Damien Wilfredo. Leela didn't know it yet. At 32, he was the youngest billionaire in the tech world, the mind behind Wilf Dynamics, a company that had grown from a college dorm project into a global empire. Hours earlier, he had signed a deal worth over $2 billion, a project poised to revolutionize artificial intelligence. But victory felt hollow. Success had stripped away his privacy, left him surrounded by people who saw him as a transaction rather than a man. The Velvet Hour was one of the few places in the city where he could sit in the shadows and simply exist. And then he saw her, tear-stained cheeks, eyes clouded with something raw and unguarded. In a city full of masks and careful performances, she was startling in her vulnerability. He rose from his seat, bourbon in hand, and walked toward her booth. "Excuse me," Damien said, his voice low and even. "I don't mean to intrude, but sometimes it's easier to talk to a stranger than a friend." Leela blinked at him, caught off guard by his directness, but there was something in his gaze steady and hurried that made her nod toward the empty seat across from her. "I'm not sure I'm good company tonight," she admitted. He slid into the booth anyway, raising his glass in a toast to terrible days and the drinks that help us survive them. A reluctant smile tugged at her lips. She tapped her glass against his. "To dreams that turn into nightmares. That," he said with a faint curve of his mouth, "sounds like a story worth hearing." And for the next 2 hours, she told him everything. How she had convinced herself that Adrian's quiet, measured affection was a kind of mature love worth holding onto. How she had ignored the quiet signs that something was wrong, because starting over at 28 felt like admitting failure. Damien listened without interruption, his eyes never leaving hers. In return, he offered pieces of himself about the loneliness of power, the endless performance of success, and the difficulty of finding anyone who wanted him, not the empire he had built. Somewhere between the second and third drink, Leela laughed. Really laughed. The sound startled her. Damien's dry humor chipped away at the day's devastation, pulling her back from the edge. "You know the worst part," she said, her words loosening with the whiskey. "I spent so much time planning a wedding that I never stopped to think if I even wanted the marriage." "Maybe," Damien said softly, "today wasn't a disaster. Maybe it was a rescue." She stared at him, feeling the truth of it settle somewhere deep. And before she could think, before she could stop herself, she leaned across the table and kissed him. The contact was electric whiskey and warmth and the sharp taste of freedom. Damien's surprise lasted only a heartbeat before his hand rose to her cheek, drawing her closer. This was nothing like the polite, predictable kisses she'd endured with Adrian. This was fire. When they finally broke apart, breathless, reality came rushing back. "I should go," she whispered, pulling back. "I'm sorry. I don't know what came over me." "Don't apologize," Damien murmured, his voice rougher now. "That was the most honest thing that's happened to me in years." But Leela was already gathering her things, her cheeks hot with a mix of embarrassment and alcohol. She tossed some bills on the table and left without looking back. Damien sat in the dim booth long after she'd gone, the taste of her kiss lingering like a question he wasn't sure how to answer. The next morning, Leela woke with a pounding head and the ache of too many regrets. Her phone was littered with missed calls, Adrian, her mother, friends demanding answers. But the only thing she could think about was the stranger who had made her feel more alive in one evening than she had in years. She didn't know his last name. She had no way to find him, and she was certain she never would. Somewhere across the city, Damien Wolf sat in his penthouse, wondering if he'd just lost the one woman who had looked straight past his fortune and seen him. Neither of them knew that fate wasn't finished with them yet. 3 weeks after she had walked out of the hotel in her jeans and sweater instead of an ivory wedding gown, Leila Fairchild sat in her cramped apartment, staring at the pale pink slip in her hands as if the paper itself had the power to unravel her life even further. It had arrived that morning by courier gold, impersonal and final. Sterling & Co., the marketing firm where she had worked for 5 years, was downsizing due to unforeseen financial difficulties. That was the official line. The truth, plastered across business news headlines, was far uglier. Thomas Sterling, the company's polished and much photographed CEO, had been caught embezzling more than $2 million from client accounts. In the aftermath, Sterling & Co. was hemorrhaging clients, and to keep the doors open even another month, they were cutting staff. Lila's name had been on the list. Her savings, never robust to begin with, had been gutted by non-refundable deposits for a wedding that had evaporated in a haze of betrayal. Her credit cards were maxed from furnishing and decorating an apartment she had chosen specifically for her married life, with a security deposit so steep it had taken months of careful budgeting to afford. She felt like the floor had dropped out from under her again. Her phone lit up with Maya Lin's name. Leila hesitated before answering. "Please tell me you still have your job," Maya said in lieu of hello. "I got fired this morning," Leila said, her voice flat. Maya's voice softened, all sympathy now. "I just saw the news about Sterling. I can't believe this. Do you want me to come over? We can brainstorm. Your brilliant Samin will see that." Leila bit back the bitter laugh that rose in her throat. "The problem is, Maya, everyone in this industry reads the same headlines, and the scandal's making the rounds fast. No one is going to rush to hire someone whose last company just went up in flames." Maya didn't try to argue. "Come over tonight. We'll figure it out together." But when Leila hung up, she didn't move. She just sat, staring at the pale pink paper until the edges blurred. The next week was a blur of applications and polite rejections. She sent her resume to every marketing agency within a 50-mile radius. The replies were all the same, some variation of, "We appreciate your interest, but at this time we've decided to move forward with other candidates." Those who didn't outright reject her were freezing new hires until Sterling's mess faded from the news. By the end of the week, Leila was combing job boards for anything administrative assistant, customer service rep, anything that would keep the lights on. That's when she saw it. Personal assistant to the CEO, Wolf Dynamics. The posting was refreshingly direct. They wanted someone with a degree, exceptional communication skills, discretion, and the ability to manage complex schedules. The salary was almost too generous for the title. For a moment, suspicion kept her finger from clicking the apply button. Jobs that sounded this perfect rarely were, but the rent wasn't going to wait for her pride to recover. She stayed up most of the night crafting her application. She highlighted her organizational skills, her experience juggling multiple high-profile projects, and her ability to handle demanding clients. She touched lightly on her marketing background, not wanting to tie herself too closely to Sterling, but emphasized her crisis management skills, her discretion, and her attention to detail. By dawn, she pressed send, telling herself it was a long shot. 3 days later, her phone rang with an unfamiliar number. "Miss Fairchild." The voice on the other end was cool, crisp, and unmistakably professional. "This is Isabella Crane, Director of Human Resources at Wolf Dynamics. We've reviewed your application and would like to schedule an interview." Leila straightened instinctively, though she was alone in her kitchen. "Yes, absolutely. When would be convenient?" "Tomorrow at 2 o'clock, if that works for you," Isabella replied. "I should mention this position requires the highest level of discretion. Our CEO values his privacy above all else and expects complete confidentiality from his staff. Do you understand?" "Of course," Leila said without hesitation. "May I ask who I'd be working for?" There was the faintest pause. "You'll meet him if you're selected for the final interview. The initial screening will be with myself and our head of operations, Lucas Grant." The moment the call ended, Leila opened her laptop and began researching Wolf Dynamics. The company was a titan in artificial intelligence and data security, its stock price having tripled in the last 2 years. But information about its CEO was curiously limited. Most articles referred to him simply as the reclusive genius behind Wolf Dynamics. No recent photos, no glossy magazine profiles. She didn't think much of it. In fact, she was almost reassured Samin, who valued privacy, wouldn't want an assistant who was more interested in gossip than work. The next day, she arrived at Wolf Dynamics headquarters 15 minutes early. The building was all glass and steel, rising like a shard of the future into the downtown skyline. Inside, the lobby gleamed marble floors, muted lighting, and artwork so expensive it looked like it should be roped off. Isabella Crane was as poised as her voice, still elegant, with the kind of posture that made you feel like you should stand straighter just by proximity. Lucas Grant, with his graying temples and steady voice, exuded the authority of someone who was accustomed to making decisions with weight. The interview went far better than Leela dared hope. Isabella seemed impressed by her marketing background, noting that the CEO often navigated tricky public relations situations. Lucas emphasized the demands of the role: long hours, high pressure, complete flexibility. "I'm used to high-pressure environments," Leela said truthfully, "and I don't have any personal commitments that would interfere with work." The words stung a little, a reminder of what she'd lost. But they were honest. Isabella's lips curved into an approving smile. "Excellent. There's one final step: meeting the CEO himself. Are you available now?" Lila's pulse jumped. Yes. They led her to a private elevator. Lucas pressed the button for the top floor. "He can be intense," Lucas said with a half smile. "Don't take it personally if he seems abrupt. He's just very focused on efficiency." The elevator doors opened to a reception area with floor-to-ceiling windows framing the city like a living mural. A heavily pregnant woman behind the desk, Nina Walsh, according to the nameplate, smiled warmly. "He's in his office. Fair warning's been in meetings all morning." Lucas knocked on the door, then pushed it open without waiting. "Sir, we have the final candidate for Nina's replacement." Leela stepped inside and froze. The man standing before the windows had his back to her, phone pressed to his ear. His voice was low, decisive. "I understand the timeline is tight, but we can't sacrifice quality for speed. Give the development team what they need, but the product must be flawless." He ended the call and turned, and Lila's world tilted. Damien Wolf, the stranger from the Velvet R, the man who had listened to her pour out her broken heart over whiskey, the man she had kissed like her life depended on, Iton, then walked away from without looking back. For a moment, neither of them moved. His expression shifted: surprise, recognition, something warmer, and then a smooth, professional mask slid into place. "Miss Fairchild," he said evenly, gesturing toward the chair across from his desk. "Please, have a seat." She sat, her knees not entirely steady. "I've reviewed your application," he continued. "Your background in marketing is impressive. Your references speak highly of your work ethic and attention to detail." "Thank you, Mr. Wilf," she managed. His gaze held hers for a fraction longer than necessary, something unreadable flickering there before he began asking questions. Her availability, her computer skills, her ability to maintain confidentiality. Each one felt double-edged, both a professional requirement and a reminder of the night they'd met. "This position requires absolute discretion," he said finally. "My personal life and business dealings must remain completely confidential." "Can you commit to that?" "Yes," she said without hesitation. "I understand the importance of keeping personal and professional matters separate." When Lucas asked why she'd left Sterling & Co., Leela gave the answer she'd practiced announcing: legal troubles unrelated to her work, seeking stability. Damien's pen moved across the page, but his eye sharp and searching never left her face. After a few more questions, he closed her file. "Do you have any questions for me?" "Yes," she said, steadying herself. "What are the biggest challenges facing your current projects, and how could the right assistant help?" For the first time since she'd walked in, his mouth curved into something almost like the smile she remembered. "The biggest challenge is maintaining focus while managing constant interruptions." The right assistant helps create an environment where real work can happen. He glanced at Isabella and Lucas. Could you give us a moment alone? When the door closed, he leaned back in his chair. Leela, he said quietly, her name sounding far too intimate in this polished office. Did you know who I was when you applied? No, she said truthfully. The posting didn't list your name, and I didn't research the CEO until after I applied. Even then, you keep a low profile. He studied her for a long moment. That night at the bar she began, but he interrupted. What if I don't want it to be a mistake? Her heart gave a painful jolt. I need this job, she said at last. I can't afford to complicate it with whatever this is. He nodded slowly, though something in his eyes didn't agree. You're hired, Miss Fairchild. Nina will train you for the next 2 weeks. She left the office with the job she desperately needed and the impossible task of pretending she'd never kissed her new boss. And somehow, she already knew forgetting was going to be the hardest part. 2 months into her role as Damien Wolf's personal assistant, Leela Fairchild had transformed his chaotic professional life into something that ran like clockwork. Before she'd arrived, his schedule had been a battlefield. Minute changes, overlapping meetings, and important calls squeezed between crises. Now, every block of his day was arranged with precision. Emails that once languished in his inbox were answered before he even saw them. Meetings began and ended on time. Travel itineraries included everything from flight details to which hotel suite had the quietest view. More than once, Damien had glanced at her with something close to astonishment when she anticipated a need before he voiced it. She handled the unpredictable demands of investors, the delicate egos of high-profile partners, and the small but essential daily details that allowed him to focus on the big picture. On the surface, they were the perfect professional team. Beneath the surface was something else entirely. They never spoke of the Velvet Hour. Damien never referenced that night, never alluded to the kiss that had burned into Lila's memory. He treated her with unflinching professionalism, courteous, always respectful, always careful to keep the distance an employer was supposed to keep from his assistant. And yet, sometimes she'd catch him watching her when he thought she wasn't looking. Sometimes his hand would brush hers as they exchanged documents, the brief contact sending a pulse of electricity up her arm. And sometimes, when their eyes met, the air seemed to thin, as though the space between them was charged with an unspoken memory. Leela told herself she could handle it. She needed this job. She had built her life back from ashes once. She could keep her heart in check. Or at least, she thought she could. One Thursday morning, she approached his desk with a folder in hand. The Peterson contract is ready for your signature, she said, placing it neatly before him. Your lunch meeting with the Japanese investors has been moved to 1:30, and David Wolf wants to discuss the quarterly projections. Damien looked up from his laptop, his dark eyes shadowed with fatigue. Did he say what he wants to discuss? He mentioned expansion strategies and potential partnership opportunities. The faint tightening round Damien's mouth told her all she needed to know. She had quickly learned that any mention of his father's name drew tension like a thundercloud. David Wolf was a legend in the business world, but his reputation for being cold, calculating, and unyielding was well earned, especially with his own son. Schedule it for tomorrow morning, Damien said, loosening his tie slightly. And Lila, could you look into a company called Blackwell Innovations? Charlotte Blackwell's outfit. My father seems interested in her latest moves. The name stirred something unpleasant in Lila's stomach. She knew of Charlotte, Damien's ex-girlfriend, a formidable businesswoman who had built her own tech empire after their split. Leela had seen photographs of her at industry events, stunning, poised, and always camera-ready. Her arm linked with Damien's in older shots. It was irrational, Leela told herself. Charlotte belonged to his past, but the thought of her walking back into his present sent a small shiver through her. The following Tuesday, Charlotte Blackwell arrived at Wolf Dynamics like a gust of winter wind sweeping through glass doors. Tall, elegant, platinum blonde hair styled to perfection. Every line of her tailored suit whispered money and power. Conversations in the lobby dimmed as heads turned to watch her glide toward the elevators. From her desk, Leela watched Charlotte step into Damien's office without hesitation, greeting him with their kisses on both cheeks. "Damien, darling," Charlotte purred, her voice dripping with a familiarity that made Lila's skin prickle. "You look wonderful. Success suits you." "Charlotte," Damien replied, his tone polite but distant. "Thank you for coming. Shall we discuss your proposal in my office?" The door closed behind them. For the next 2 hours, the sound of Charlotte's laughter floated out into the reception area, bright and melodic, threading through the air like perfume Leela couldn't escape. She tried to focus on her work, typing with more force than necessary, the keys clicking like tiny gunshots. When the door finally opened, Charlotte emerged looking triumphant, while Damien's expression was harder to read, something between consideration and unease. "Leela," he said, stopping at her desk, "could you make dinner reservations at Le Bernard for tomorrow night? 2 people, 8 o'clock. Her fingers froze above the keyboard. "Of course, Mr. Wolf. Should I know any dietary preferences?" "She doesn't eat shellfish," he said without missing a beat, then caught himself. "I mean, Miss Blackwell prefers to avoid seafood." Lila's chest tightened, but she typed the reservation without comment. Professional, polite. It wasn't her place to care who Damien Wilf had dinner with. And yet, as she pressed confirm on the reservation, a dull ache settled behind her ribs. The ache turned to urgency a week later, when trouble came knocking on Wilf Dynamics' door. It started with a whisper in the industry press claims that the company's finances were unstable. Within days, it had escalated to major clients canceling contracts and investors pulling out of deals. The name behind the attack was no surprise to Damien: Antonio Reeves, a rival businessman with a long-standing grudge. But the precision of the rumors suggested someone on the inside was feeding him information. Damien worked 18-hour days trying to contain the damage. Leela stayed late every night, fielding calls, preparing statements, and using her marketing instincts to help craft responses. One night, as the clock crept past midnight, she set a steaming cup of coffee on his desk. "The Henderson Group is reconsidering their partnership," she said. "But I think I can keep them if we offer additional security guarantees." Damien looked up at her, admiration clear even through the exhaustion in his eyes. "How did you know that's what they needed to hear?" "I studied their past contracts," she said simply. "Their biggest concern is data security. Sometimes you solve the problem by understanding the fear behind it." Their fingers brushed as he took the mug from her. Neither of them moved away immediately. The moment stretched out quite electric. "Leela," Damien said softly, "I don't know what I would do without you." The spell was broken by the sound of the door opening. Charlotte Blackwell stood there, framed in the doorway like a scene stealer making her entrance. "Working late again?" she asked, her tone sugared with disapproval. "Damien, you're going to burn out. Maybe it's time you considered my offer more seriously." Leela stiffened. Damien didn't respond, but the look he gave Charlotte was measured, guarded. Her offer, Leela would learn the next morning, was no small thing. Charlotte was proposing a meager 40% of Wolf Dynamics in exchange for the capital needed to weather the crisis. On paper, it was generous, but Leela could see the strings. Charlotte wouldn't just be a partner. She'd have daily access to Damien and all the leverage that came with it. Lila's gut told her that Charlotte's interest in the company was as personal, was professional, and if she was right, the battle for Wilf Dynamics had just become something far more dangerous. David Wilf did not enter a room. He claimed it. At 60, the patriarch of the Wilf family still carried the authority of a man who had built empires with his bare hands. His presence was a sharp contrast to Damien's more measured charisma. David was all precision and intimidation, his voice a tool as finely honed as any blade. When he arrived at Wilf Dynamics that afternoon, there was no polite preamble. The elevator door slid open, and he strode across the top floor's reception like a storm front rolling in over glassy waters. "Damien," he said, not slowing as he passed Lila's desk. His tone wasn't a greeting, it was an order. "We need to talk, and Miss Fairchild see to it that we're not disturbed." Leela rose automatically, smoothing her skirt, though her pulse kicked up. The brief, cold glance he'd given her as he swept past was enough to remind her what he'd thought of her the first time they met. Irrelevant. She closed the office door behind him. But the walls of Wolf Dynamics' executive suite were more symbolic than soundproof. David's voice carried through, sharp and unyielding. "You've let this crisis drag on far too long," David said, his tone clipped. "You're bleeding money, losing investor confidence. And now you're hesitating over the one solution that could stabilize everything." "I told you before," Damien replied evenly. "I'm not interested in Shirley Blackwell's terms." "This isn't about interest," David shot back. "It's about survival. Charlotte can inject the capital you need and bring the kind of strategic clout this company's been lacking since you started running it your way. And if you were smart, you'd marry her, cement the alliance." Lila's breath caught. She hadn't expected that. "I'm not marrying anyone for a business advantage," Damien said, his voice colder now. "Then you're a fool," David countered without hesitation. "This company is the culmination of everything we've built, and you're risking it because of pride? Or is it that assistant of yours, the one you're spending so many late nights with? I've seen the way you look at her." There was a long silence. Lila pressed her palms flat to her desk, forcing herself not to react. When David spoke again, his voice had the deadly calm of a man delivering a final warning. "Personal feelings are a luxury you can't afford right now. Choose wisely, Damien. If you won't do what's necessary, I will." An hour later, the office door opened. David Wolf emerged with the same brisk authority, barely glancing at Lila before heading for the elevators. Inside, Damien was standing by the window, his shoulders tight, his gaze fixed on the city skyline as though the answers might be hidden in the pattern of lights and shadows. Lila hesitated at the doorway. "Your father means well," she said quietly, though the words tasted like a half-truth. Damien's laugh was low and humorless. "My father sees the world in terms of profit and loss. People are assets or liabilities. He's never understood that some things matter more than the bottom line." "What matters more?" she asked, though her voice was softer now, almost afraid of what he might say. He turned then, and the weight in his gaze rooted her to the spot. "You." The single word hung between them, heavy and undeniable. Lila's breath hitched. "Damien, I know I shouldn't say that," he continued, his voice rough with something that felt dangerously close to vulnerability. "You work for me. It's unprofessional, but I can't pretend anymore. These past 2 months, watching you handle everything this crisis, my impossible schedule, my father's scrutiny with such grace, you've become more than just the person who keeps my life running. You've become the person I look forward to seeing every day." Her heart was pounding, loud enough she was sure he could hear it. "That night at the Velvet Hour, I think about it constantly," he admitted. "Not just the kiss, though I'd be lying if I said it didn't haunt me. I think about how real you were. You didn't care about my money, my status. You saw me. Do you have any idea how rare that is in my world?" Lila felt the sting of tears, but she shook her head. "This is impossible, Damien. Your father will never approve. Charlotte's offering you exactly what you need to save the company, and I'm just your assistant, with more problems attached than solutions." "You're not just anything," he said fiercely, closing the distance between them into measured steps. "You're the woman who makes me want to be better than I am. You're the person I trust with my biggest problems and my most important decisions. His words broke off as his hands came up to cradle her face. His touch was warm, steady, and when he kissed her, it was nothing like the desperate, impulsive fire of that night at the bar. This kiss was deliberate, certain, a promise. When they finally broke apart, Lila's cheeks were wet. She didn't remember when the tears had started. "What are we going to do?" she whispered. "We're going to figure it out," Damien said, his thumbs brushing away her tears. "I don't know how yet, but I'm not losing Yana to my father's expectations, not to Charlotte's manipulations, not to anyone." For a long moment, they stood there, the rest of the world held at bay. The city stretched out beneath them, glittering and endless, But in that office, everything narrowed to the space between them, an unspoken understanding that the battle ahead would be fought together. What neither of them knew then was just how quickly that battle would escalate. Charlotte would tighten her grip, how Antonio Reeves would grow bolder, and how even inside Wilf Dynamics' glass tower, betrayal was closer than either of them realized. Because while love might be worth fighting for, it was about to collide with a war for the company's very survival. The days after Damien's confession passed like the uneasy calm before a summer thunderstorm loomed, charged, and waiting to break. On the surface, nothing had changed. Leela still arrived at Wilf Dynamics each morning before most of the staff, coffee in hand, ready to keep Damien's day running like a well-oiled machine. He still moved through the office with his usual focus, issuing instructions, fielding calls, and navigating meetings without a single hint to anyone that their relationship had crossed an invisible line. But between them, everything was different. A glance across the boardroom table that lasted half a second too long, a brush of his hand against hers as he passed her a file, lingering just long enough to send heat skittering up her arm. The way his voice softened when he spoke her name, as though it were a secret meant only for him. It was dangerous, this thing between them, and as much as Leela tried to tell herself she could keep it contained, a part of her feared and maybe hoped it was already too late. Charlotte Blackwell was everywhere, not physical not yet, but her influence seemed to stretch like shadowed fingers through the halls of Wilf Dynamics. Articles in industry publications praising her innovative leadership were suddenly everywhere, with casual mentions that she was in talks with Wilf Dynamics. Whispers of her dining with key investors circulated just loudly enough to be overheard. She was playing a long game, and she was playing it well. The worst part was that Charlotte's proposal was still on the table. 40% ownership for a capital injection large enough to steady the company's listing balance sheet, and, in Damien's father's eyes, her as Damien's perfect match in business and life. Every time Leela saw the gleam in David Wolf's eyes when her name came up, she felt the ice settle a little deeper in her chest. Antonio Reeves, meanwhile, was accelerating his attacks. It began with a coordinated wave of negative press, anonymous sources claiming Wilf Dynamics was overextending itself financially, gambling on untested AI products, even mishandling client data. The stock price slid a little further with every headline. Then came the client withdrawals terminated mid-cycle, citing concerns about corporate stability. A few at first, then more. Damien was in the office earlier and later than ever, his tie abandoned by mid-afternoon, his sleeves rolled up as though sheer effort might hold the company together by force of will. Leela stayed, too. She brought him coffee without being asked, ran interference with impatient clients, and used every scrap of her marketing background to shape counter-narratives. One night, long after most of the building had gone dark, she leaned over his desk to show him a draft of a press release she'd written. "If we push this now," she said, "we can get ahead of the rumors about the Horizon project delays. I've framed it as a deliberate decision to refine the final product, emphasizing our commitment to quality." Damien scanned it quickly, then looked up at her with something that was half admiration, half relief. "You keep saving me," he murmured. "You don't need saving," she replied, though her chest warmed. "You just need someone who can see the problem from the outside." It was nearly midnight when she shut down her laptop and started gathering her things. That was when she saw an email alert pop up on Damien's secondary monitor. It was from an unlisted company account. The subject line was blank. The body contained nothing but a forwarded attachment, and the recipient was Antonio Reeves' private business address. Her stomach tightened. "Damien," she said slowly, "have you seen this?" He turned, frowning. One glance at the screen, and his expression shifted from confusion to something darker. "That's one of our internal project updates," he said quietly. "It hasn't been released to anyone outside the executive team." Lila's mind was already turning over the possibilities. That means the leak is coming from inside Wilf Dynamics. Someone with high-level clearance. They pulled up the email's metadata together, tracing the digital breadcrumbs. routing signature matches AVPN registered to Blackwell Innovations, Leela said after a few tense minutes. She looked up at him. Damien, this came from Charlotte's company. His jaw tightened, the muscle ticking just beneath his cheekbone. You think she's been feeding Reeves our internal documents? I think she'll do whatever it takes to force you into a merger, Leela said flatly. And if she's the source of these leaks, she's been orchestrating this entire crisis to back you into a corner. For a moment, Damien just stared at the screen. Then he pushed back from the desk. We're going to get proof. Enough to shut her out permanently. The next 48 hours blurred into a strategy session that felt more like covert operations than corporate damage control. Leela dug through every suspicious data transfer, every access log, every irregularity in the server activity. Damien leveraged contacts in the cybersecurity world to trace and verify the leaks without tipping off their source. The deeper they dug, the clearer the pattern became. Each of Antonio Reeves' most damaging exposes had been preceded by a data access request from a terminal tied to Blackwell Innovations. The timestamps were a perfect match. By the end of the second day, they had enough evidence to make Charlotte's careful, polished facade crack wide open. They didn't confront her at the office. Damien insisted on a neutral, public settings where Charlotte couldn't control the environment. He chose an upscale restaurant that was equal parts elegance and surveillance risk. The kind of place where everyone pretended not to eavesdrop while doing exactly that. Charlotte arrived looking like she'd stepped out of a glossy magazine silk dress, diamond earrings, the kind of smile that promised victory before the battle had even begun. Damien, she said warmly, sliding into the booth across from him. You look tired. This crisis is wearing on you. Please, take my offer. Let me help. Damien slid a manila folder across the table. I know what you've been doing. She opened it, her gaze flicking over the pages. Her smile didn't falter immediately, but Lila sitting beside Damien caught the faint tightening at the corners of her mouth. This is paranoia, Charlotte said lightly, closing the folder. You've always had a suspicious streak. The digital signatures don't lie, Leela said for the first time, her voice even but unflinching. Every leak to Antonio Reeves came through your servers. Every one. Charlotte's smile finally slipped. You have no idea what you've cost yourself, she said coldly to Damien. I offered you everything: power, stability, a future, and you chose her, an assistant with no pedigree, no influence. She will never be able to give you what I can. I chose someone who sees me for who I am, Damien replied. Not for what I can give her. Charlotte's exit was as swift as her arrival. She stood, her heels clicking against the marble floor as she left without looking back. But Leela knew better than to think it was over. Charlotte Blackwell didn't lose gracefully. What neither of them knew yet was that her next move would be far more personal and far more dangerous than anything she'd tried so far. The day after the confrontation with Charlotte, the atmosphere inside Wilf Dynamics shifted. It was subtle at first, quick glances exchanged in the hallways, whispered conversations that broke off when Damien walked past, but word traveled fast in corporate circles. By midweek, rumors of Charlotte Blackwell's sudden withdrawal from the merger discussions were making their way through industry channels. The official story was that strategic differences had stalled the deal, and officially, anyone who had been in business long enough knew that Charlotte had been outmaneuvered. Damien didn't gloat. He didn't have the time. With Charlotte no longer feeding inside information to Antonio Reeves, the attacks on the company began to lose their sting. Stock prices steadied. A few cautious clients returned. But rebuilding trust after weeks of bad press was going to take time, and Damien knew it. So did Leela. She was in his office early that Monday morning, coffee already waiting on his desk when he walked in. You have a 9:30 with the legal team, she said, sliding his schedule toward him. And I've drafted statements for the media about the return of the Henderson Group. I thought we should emphasize the stability and long-term vision angle. Damien took the papers from her, scanning them quickly. You've been doing more than just running my calendar. You needed more than just a calendar manager, she replied simply. Their eyes met, And for a moment the noise of the office beyond the glass walls faded. The unspoken truth hung between them. They were no longer operating as boss and assistant. They were a team, and whatever battles lay ahead, they were fighting them side by side. That evening, David Wolf requested a private meeting. Leela had no idea what to expect. Their interactions with Damien's father had been minimal, and none of them warm. But when she stepped into the conference room, she was surprised to find David alone, seated at the head of the table, his hands folded over a legal pad. "Miss Fairchild," he said, his tone as brisk as ever. "Sit." She did, keeping her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. "I underestimated you," David said without preamble. "I thought you were a distraction, but you've shown yourself to be competent and loyal. You played a role in removing Charlotte from the picture. That required initiative." "Thank you," Leela said cautiously. David studied her, his gaze as sharp as a scalpel. "Damien values you. That's clear. Just be certain you're not leading him into decisions based on emotion rather than strategy." Leela met his gaze without flinching. "I want what's best for this company and for Damien. Those goals aren't mutually exclusive." For a long moment, David didn't speak. Then, with the faintest of nods, he closed his notebook. "We'll see." When she relayed the exchange to Damien later that night, his brows lifted in surprise. "He doesn't hand out respect easily," Damien said. "You must have impressed him." "I'm not sure I'd call it respect," she said dryly. "I would." He leaned back in his chair, regarding her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "And I'm glad he's finally starting to see what I've known since the day you walked into my office." Her lips curved despite herself. "And what's that?" "That you're the best thing that's happened to me in a very long time." They didn't speak of feelings again that night, not directly, but something shifted. The next morning, Damien began looping her into high-level strategy calls, introducing her to clients as his strategic operations partner. It was an unofficial title, but one that told the entire company she wasn't just the woman managing his schedule. Ash was someone he trusted to help steer the ship. And Leela rose to the role effortlessly. She negotiated with wary investors, reframed media narratives, and streamlined project timelines with a precision that earned her nods from even the most skeptical department heads. The change wasn't lost on the rest of the staff. Conversations quieted when she entered a room, not in cold dismissal, but in watchful acknowledgement. One evening, as they worked late in the quiet hum of the nearly empty office, Damien looked up from his laptop. "You've been carrying as much of this crisis as I have," he said. "I don't know how to thank you." "You don't have to," she said, stacking a pile of signed contracts. "I'm not here for gratitude. I'm here because I believe in this company and in you." Something in his expression softened. He rose from his chair, crossing to where she stood by the window. The city stretched out below them, glittering in the darkness. "Leela," he said quietly, "we've been fighting side by side for weeks now, and I meant what I said before. I'm not losing you." Before she could respond, his hand found her snot in the rushed, heated way of that first kiss, but in a steady, grounding clasp that felt like an unspoken vow. It was the kind of touch that said they weren't just surviving this together, they were building something. And though the battles weren't over, for the first time in weeks, Leela felt certain they could win. The first sign that Antonia Reeves wasn't finished came in the form of a terse email from Wilf Dynamics' legal team. Subject: urgent cease and desist review. Body: Antonia Reeves is launching a formal complaint to the SEC regarding alleged data manipulation in Wilf Dynamics' quarterly reports. Leela read the message twice, her fingers tightening round her phone. She didn't need to be a corporate lawyer to understand what it meant. This wasn't just another smear in the press, and SEC investigation could freeze projects, scare away investors, and do permanent damage to the company's reputation, whether or not the allegations held water. When she stepped into Damien's office to tell him, he was already on the phone with head of legal, his voice low but hard. "No, we have nothing to hide," he said, pacing near the window. "Yes, I want the audit started immediately. No surprises." When he hung up, His eyes found hers instantly. Antonio's trying to finish what he started. The following days were a blur of controlled chaos. The finance team worked round the clock to compile documents proving every figure was legitimate. Leila coordinated between departments, ensuring there were no gaps or delays. She fielded calls from anxious investors, crafting talking points that reassured without revealing too much. But late one evening, she noticed something odd in the document logs. A set of philosophies of financial spreadsheets had been accessed not once, but twice, in a 2-hour window. The second time, they'd been downloaded onto an external drive. Damien, she said, stepping into his office with her laptop. Look at this. He scanned the logs quickly, his jaw tightening. That terminal is on the 24th floor, marketing division. That's not where these files belong, Leila said. And look, this external drive ID doesn't match any registered to our stuff. This is how Antonio's getting his ammunition. They made a plan. If they could catch the transfer in real time, they could prove who was leaking the data and exactly where it was going. It meant baiting the mole into making another move. And Leila volunteered without hesitation to help set the trap. It was risky. If the leaker realized she was onto them, she could become their next target. But Damien didn't try to talk her out of it. He simply said, "We do this together." The following night, Leila stayed late, working on a batch of mock financial documents that painted a misleading picture of Wolf Dynamics to test nothing illegal, but enough to be enticing if someone was fishing for damaging information. Sure enough, an hour later, she saw the alert pop up. The files were being accessed from the same 24th floor terminal. She sent a quick message to Damien. "It's happening now." Within minutes, Damien appeared, moving silently to stand beside her as they traced the activity. The data was routed to a private server registered against a shell company linked to Antonio Reeves. The next morning, Damien and Leila walked into a conference room where Antonio was waiting, flanked by his legal counsel. The man looked perfectly composed, his tailored suit and smug smile radiating confidence. "I assume this is about my SEC filing," Antonio said, leaning back in his chair. "No," Damien replied, sliding a folder across the table. "This is about your illegal access to our internal systems." Antonio's smile faltered, just slightly. "Every transfer is time-stamped, traced, and tied to a server you control," Leila added, her voice even but edged with steel. "You didn't just cross a line, you obliterated it." Damien's legal team laid out the evidence piece by piece. By the time they were finished, Antonio's lawyer was whispering urgently in his ear. The fallout was swift. Within days, Antonio withdrew his SEC complaint. The news outlets that had been so eager to print his accusations now reported his quiet retreat with barely disguised curiosity. And for Wolf Dynamics, the tide began to turn in earnest. Clients who had been sitting on the fence recommitted. New opportunities began trickling in. The worst was over. That Friday night, the office was nearly empty when Damien stopped by Lila's desk. "Come with me," he said. She raised a brow. "Where?" "You'll see." They ended up in the velvet hearth, same dimly lit corner where they'd first met. Ethan Cole, the bartender, raised his brows in recognition. "To drinks," Damien told him, then gestured for Leila to sit. "I thought we could come full circle," Damien said when they were alone. "The night we met I was trying to disappear. You were running from something. And somehow, in the middle of all that, we found each other." Her chest tightened. "We've come a long way from that night. And we're going further," he said simply. "Leila, I don't want to keep pretending this is just professional. You're the reason I made it through the last 2 months with my sanity intact. You're my partner in every way that matters." She could feel the weight of his words settling into her bones, anchoring her. "This is risky," she said quietly. "People will talk. Your father will deal with it." Damien cut in. "I'm done letting other people dictate what matters in my life." He reached across the table, his hand warm over hers. "I want you with me, Leila, not just at work, everywhere." She smiled then, slow and certain. "Then you've got me." When he leaned in to kiss her, it wasn't the desperate fire of that first time, nor the tentative promise of the second. This was steady, claiming, and entirely theirs. Outside, the city moved on as it always did. Cars, lights, respite inside that quiet booth. Lila Fairchild knew her life had changed again. Only this time, it was by choice. And whatever battles lay ahead, they would face them together. The weeks following Antonio Reeves' retreat felt almost unreal. For so long, Wolf Dynamics had been fighting uphill every day, another headline to counter, another client to reassure, another crisis to contain. Now, the air in the building felt lighter. Conversations in the halls were no longer hushed. People smiled more, laughed more. There was a new sense of momentum, a collective recognition that the storm had passed. And at the center of it all, Damien and Lila worked with the same precision and partnership they had honed during the hardest days. Only now, there was no longer the quiet tension of unspoken feelings. That line had been crossed deliberately, irrevocably. They didn't announce it, at least not at first. Their relationship lived in the spaces between public moments. The way Damien's hand would brush hers when no one was looking. The way his voice would soften when he called her name. The rare private smiles they shared in crowded rooms. But keeping it entirely private proved impossible. It began with a single photograph snapped by an industry reporter at a charity gala. Damien had been leaning down to murmur something in her ear, and she'd been smiling at him in a way that left little doubt about the nature of what they shared. By the next morning, the image had made the rounds in certain business gossip columns. The headlines were predictable. Wolf Dynamics CEO spotted with mystery woman. Damien Wolf's new right-hand and maybe more. When the news reached David Wolf, Lila braced for a confrontation. Instead, he simply called Damien into his office and, after a long pause, said, "You've made your choice. Make sure it's a wise one." For David, that was as close to acceptance as anyone could expect. Inside the company, reactions were mixed. Some staff treated her differently, more careful, more formal, as though she'd suddenly become an extension of the CEO's authority. Others looked at her with new respect, remembering how she'd stood beside Damien during the company's darkest months. Lila handled it the same way she had handled every challenge since stepping into Wolf Dynamics, with quiet competence. The work came first, and she made sure no one could accuse her of earning her place through anything but skill. By the end of the quarter, Wolf Dynamics had not only recovered its losses, but posted its strongest growth in 2 years. The Henderson Group signed a multi-year contract, European tech consortiums came on board, and the company's share price climbed steadily. The boardroom no longer felt like a battlefield, it felt like a launchpad. It was during one of those late evening planning sessions, when the office was nearly empty, that Damien looked up from his notes and said, "You've changed everything for me, Lila. Not just the company, me." She smiled faintly. "We changed it together." He leaned back in his chair, studying her. "Do you trust me?" "Completely." "Good," he said, standing. "Come with me." They ended up at the Belvedere. It was almost exactly as it had been the night they met. Dim light, soft jazz, Ethan Cole behind the bar. The corner booth where they had shared their first drink, and that impulsive kiss, was empty, waiting. Damien led her there without a word. When they were seated, Ethan appeared with 2 glasses of top-shelf bourbon. "On the house," he said with a knowing smile. Before retreating, Damien rested his elbows on the table, his gaze steady on hers. "The night I met you, I told myself it was just chance. But looking back, it feels like it was the start of everything that matters." Her throat tightened. "It was for me too." He reached into his jacket pocket and set a small black velvet box on a table. For a heartbeat, Lila could only stare. "Lila Fairchild," Damien said quietly, "you walked into my life on the worst night I could remember, and somehow you turned it into the beginning of my real life. You've stood by me through every fight, every setback, every moment when it would have been easier to walk away. I don't want to imagine a future where you're not right here beside me." He opened the box. Inside was a ring, simple, elegant, the diamond catching the warm light, but not overpowering it. "Marry me," he said. She didn't hesitate. Yes, the word felt like a release off the last doubts, the last fears. He slipped the ring onto her finger, and for a moment they simply sat there, smiling like they were the only two people in the world. When he leaned across the table to kiss her, it was slow and certain, the kind of kiss that promised not just love, but partnership, trust, and a shared future. They were married 6 months later. The wedding was nothing like the one Leela had once planned for Adrian Cross. No hundreds of guests, no ornate ballroom, no staged perfection. Instead, it was held in a sunlit garden with only their closest friends and family. Meyer stood at her side as maid of honor. David Wolfe, though still not a man given to open displays of affection, shook Lila's hand after the ceremony and said quietly, "Welcome to the family." When they danced their first dance as husband and wife, Damien leaned down and whispered in her ear, "Thank you for kissing a stranger in a bar and changing both our lives forever." She laughed softly, resting her head against his shoulder. "Thank you for being worth the risk." Wilf Dynamics continued to thrive, expanding internationally, launching innovative AI products, and cementing its reputation as a leader in the industry. Leela eventually stepped into the role of Chief Marketing Officer, her campaigns helping to double the company's market share within 2 years. Charlotte Blackwell's empire collapsed under the weight of investigations into her corporate espionage. Antonio Reeves, stripped of his inside source and facing legal repercussions, quietly disappeared from the business landscape. And through it all, Damien and Leela remained exactly what they had been since the moment they chose each other, partners in every sense. Sometimes Leela thought back to that first date silk wedding dress, the betrayal in the hotel garden, the desperate escape into the city. It had felt like the end of everything she had planned for her life, but it had been the beginning. And as she stood beside Damien, watching the sunset over the city they'd fought so hard to build a place in, she knew she wouldn't have changed a single thing. The city skyline glittered beneath the early evening sky, the glass towers reflecting the last blush of sunset as Leela Wolfe stepped onto the balcony of their penthouse apartment. The soft hum of the bustling streets below mingled with the distant murmur of traffic and laughter drifting up from the park across the way. She took a deep breath, letting the cool breeze wash over her and loosen the weight of the day. In the past few years, her life had changed in ways she never could have imagined, from the shattered dreams of a cancelled wedding to the fierce, unexpected love that had transformed everything. Inside, the soft glow of warm lights spilled from the living room. Damien was there, seated at the grand piano that had become their sanctuary after long days filled with meetings and deadlines. His fingers danced over the keys, playing a melody that wove through the space like a tender promise. Leela smiled, watching him with the same quiet awe she'd felt the night they met at the Velvet. Only now that feeling was deeper, richer, woven through years of shared struggles and victories. They had built something extraordinary together, a company that led the industry, a partnership that balanced power and vulnerability, and a family filled with laughter and hope. Their daughter, a bright-eyed 6-year-old with Damien's dark hair and Lila's laugh, ran across the room, chasing after their golden retriever. The joy in her eyes was the kind of happiness Leela had once thought impossible. Damien looked up and caught her gaze, his smile full of warmth and love. He closed the piano softly and stood, crossing the room in long strides to take her hand. "We've come so far," he said, his voice low and steady. "We have," Leela agreed, squeezing his hand. "Thank you for trusting me," he whispered, "for choosing to fight for us." She rested her head on his shoulder, feeling the steady beat of his heart, a rhythm that had become her home. Outside, the city pulsed with endless possibility. Inside, they knew that whatever the future held, they would face it together, unshakable, unbreakable, and forever intertwined.